Welcome to the Quotive Corner. Today's quote is 2 lines from an 18th century English poem, and it might be one of the most precise observations about the relationship between knowledge and wisdom ever compressed into a single couplet. Knowledge is proud that he has learned so much. Wisdom is humble that he knows no more. That's William Cowper from his long poem, The Task, published in 1785, Book 6, The Winter Walk at Noon. Cowper was an English poet and hymn writer, one of the most widely read poets of the late 18th century and a significant forerunner of the Romantic movement. Samuel Taylor Coleridge called him the best modern poet of his time. Wordsworth admired him deeply. He is less well known today than he deserves to be, which makes him exactly the kind of figure this show enjoys putting in front of an audience. A brief note before we get into the quote. This couplet is actually the closing 2 lines of a 10-line passage that is worth reading in its entirety. Cowper spends the preceding 8 lines building the philosophical case that knowledge and wisdom are not only different things, but are often entirely disconnected, and that knowledge, without wisdom, does more to burden its possessor than to elevate them. If today's episode leaves you wanting more Cowper, I'd encourage you to seek out the full passage from The Task, Book 6. It rewards the time. But for today, the 2 lines. The structure of the couplet is perfectly balanced, almost architectural. Knowledge on one side, wisdom on the other. And the defining characteristic of each is its relationship to what it has. Knowledge is proud that it has learned so much. Wisdom is humble that it knows no more. The same quantity of information, completely opposite responses to it. And in that contrast, Cowper is identifying something about how genuine understanding actually develops, and what gets in the way. Pride, in the context Cowper is describing, is not simply arrogance, it's a specific cognitive posture. The posture of someone who treats what they've accumulated as a destination rather than a point along a route. The proud knower looks at what they've learned and feels satisfied, complete, finished. The learning has produced a conclusion about themselves. I am someone who knows. And that conclusion, once formed, tends to close the door to further inquiry. Why keep looking when you've already arrived? This is the trap that expertise can set for itself. The person who has accumulated a great deal of knowledge in a domain, years of study, credentials, experience, is simultaneously the person most tempted to stop asking the questions that would take them further, not because they have run out of questions, but because the pride of knowing has made the questions feel less necessary. The further you go in any field, the more you know, and the more comfortable the assumption becomes that you've mapped most of the territory worth mapping. The horizon stops looking like a destination and starts looking like a background. Wisdom, in Cowper's formulation, works exactly the other way, and here's what makes his observation genuinely surprising. Wisdom doesn't produce pride in proportion to its depth. It produces humility, not false modesty, not the performance of smallness that sometimes passes for humility, but a genuine recognition that the more you understand, the more the understanding reveals about how much remains. The wisest people in any tradition, in any field, tend to be the ones who are most acutely aware of what they don't know, not because they know less, but because they know enough to see the vastness of what lies beyond the edge of what they've mapped. This is sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect in contemporary psychology. The observed pattern that people with limited knowledge in a domain tend to overestimate their competence, while genuine experts tend to underestimate theirs. Cowper was describing the same phenomenon in verse 2.5 centuries before the research existed to name it. The less you know, the more complete your map feels. The more you know, the more clearly you can see how much territory the map leaves blank. The scientist Isaac Newton described himself near the end of his life as a boy playing on the seashore, collecting pebbles while the great ocean of truth lay undiscovered before him. That is Cowper's wisdom made biographical. A man who had transformed the understanding of physics, mathematics, and optics, who had arguably done more to expand human knowledge than any single person before him, and whose deepest engagement with that knowledge had produced not pride, but the humbling recognition of how much ocean remained. There is a practical dimension to this that connects directly to how people actually learn and grow. Pride in what you've learned tends to close conversations. It positions you as someone who has arrived rather than someone still in motion, which makes other people less likely to challenge you and makes you less likely to welcome the challenge if they try. Humility about how much you know tends to open conversations. It signals genuine curiosity, willingness to be wrong, and the kind of intellectual openness that allows new understanding to actually arrive. Pride in knowledge is self-sealing. Wisdom's humility is self-expanding. Referring to a prior episode on this channel, this also connects to something John Stuart Mill pointed at in his observation that teachers and learners fall asleep at their posts the moment there is no enemy in the field, that the unchallenged mind stops engaging with its own understanding and begins to coast. The proud knower has effectively declared the field clear. There is no enemy left. The questions have been settled. And so the mind rests. The wise person, by contrast, knows there is always an enemy in the field, not a threat to be defeated, but a question to be pursued, a gap to be examined, a horizon to be moved toward. The humility that wisdom produces is not resignation. It is fuel. Now, the honest counterpoint, because this show doesn't skip it. Humility, taken too far or performed rather than genuine, can become its own obstacle. The person who refuses to act on what they know because they can always imagine knowing more, who treats the incompleteness of their understanding as a reason never to commit, decide, or lead, has turned a virtue into a paralysis. Cowper is not making an argument for chronic uncertainty or the abdication of judgment. He is describing the inner disposition of the genuinely wise person, humble about the limits of their understanding while still capable of acting decisively within those limits. Intellectual humility and practical confidence are not opposites. They coexist in the person who has genuinely wrestled with how much they don't know and made peace with proceeding anyway. Cowper wrote this in 1785 in a poem about a winter walk through the English countryside. He was, by most accounts, a deeply anxious man, prone to periods of severe depression, haunted by religious doubt, living quietly in a small English town far from the literary centers of his time. He was not a man who projected pride or certainty about much of anything, which may be exactly why he understood, with such precision, the difference between the person who mistakes accumulation for a rival and the person who understands that the more you genuinely know, the more clearly you can see how far there is still to go. Knowledge is proud. Wisdom is humble. Not because wisdom has less, because wisdom understands more about what having more actually means. Thanks for spending a few minutes here at the Quotive Corner. If this one made you think about your own relationship to what you know, and whether pride or humility is the more honest response to it, that's worth a moment of genuine reflection. And remember, wisdom isn't in the quote, it's in the reflection. I hope to see you soon in the next episode.